This interview was conducted courtesy of Ross Owen. We usually begin these conversations right at the start of the journey, focusing first on the audition process. So, how did you eventually land the role of Roy Cobb? What was the audition experience like for you? Yeah, absolutely, I can talk about that. Interestingly enough, I never actually auditioned specifically for Roy Cobb at any stage during the process. A lot of the actors were reading for different roles, and I was one of the many who auditioned for Spears. I also read for Blythe, Mark Warren's character, and Heffron as well. There were several parts floating around during auditions, but Cobb was never one of the characters I directly tested for. Most of my early reads were actually for Heffron. From what I gathered, the casting team were trying to understand who we were as people, and what kind of qualities each actor naturally brought to different characters. It felt less about locking people into one role immediately, and more about discovering where everyone fit best. Unfortunately, Roy Cobb himself had passed away back in 1990, so you never had the opportunity to meet him personally while preparing for the role. Were you able to speak with any of the veterans about him, or how did you approach researching the character? It was quite an unusual experience, really. And to be fair, this was a long time ago now, so memory can blur around the edges, but I distinctly remember the atmosphere around the veterans. Every one of them was incredibly kind, respectful, and welcoming. Whenever they met actors portraying their comrades, there was almost this emotional sense that they were reconnecting with younger versions of the men they once knew. It was genuinely moving. But with Cobb, there seemed to be a slightly different reaction. Not hostile exactly, but more distant. I don't think there was much personal attachment there. Because of the dishonorable discharge and the reputation he carried, I got the sense that he wasn't especially close with many of them. The thing about Cobb is that he'd actually spent more time in military service than many of the younger recruits around him. Before joining the parachute infantry, he'd already served for years. He'd participated in an assault landing in Africa, and had even survived a torpedo attack that sank the troop ship he was traveling on while returning to the United States. So although there's often this perception of Cobb as being cowardly, I was very aware that I didn't want to portray him that way. I never approached the role thinking this was a man who lacked courage. In hindsight, I think he simply understood the reality of war better than most because he'd already lived through it. Experiences like that make people more cautious and more aware of consequences. That isn't cowardice. If anything, it can make someone stronger and more hardened internally. Sometimes people entering combat for the first time can carry a kind of bravado because they haven't yet seen the true cost of it. I don't think Cobb had any of that left in him. He seemed resigned to the fact that he was there and had a job to do, but he didn't romanticize the experience because he already knew exactly what war could take from a person. Ambrose's book also suggests there may have been bitterness on Cobb's part, that his military career hadn't progressed the way he believed it should have. After all, by that stage he was still serving as a private, despite all his years in the army. That's one of the difficult parts when you're portraying a real individual. First and foremost, you want to respect the actual person and the people connected to them. But at the same time, as an actor, you're working from a script. You have to ask yourself why certain lines were written, and what motivates the character to say those things. You inevitably bring your own interpretation into it. It's a complicated balance because you're trying to honor reality while also creating a believable dramatic portrayal, especially when you never had the chance to know the person yourself. Did you ever challenge the producers on historical accuracy? Donnie Wahlberg, for example, would sometimes speak up if something involving Carwood Lipton wasn't accurate. There actually was one occasion where I did. I remember getting a call saying there was a car waiting outside my house because they needed me on set for episode 9, the Switzerland episode with the cheese factory scenes. Apparently they'd rewritten things and added Cobb into the sequence, but I said, well, Cobb had already been discharged by then. He wasn't in Switzerland. That was probably the one clear moment where I pushed back and said this wasn't historically accurate. I wasn't there because Cobb himself wasn't there. The funny part is that I wasn't even home at the time. I was in Blackpool on a roller coaster. Completely true story. I actually took the phone call while riding the Pepsi Max roller coaster. So there's this production car sitting outside my house waiting to take me to set while I'm flying around upside down in Blackpool telling them Cobb wasn't in Switzerland and neither am I. That ended up being the end of that conversation. That's brilliant. Exactly the kind of behind-the-scenes story people love hearing. Yeah, it was pretty surreal. One minute they're trying to rewrite scenes involving stolen cheese, the next I'm arguing historical accuracy while strapped into a roller coaster. There's also that plane sequence involving George Lewis switching seats with Cobb. A lot of people don't realize that really happened. I didn't know that at first either. Apparently Lewis asked Cobb to swap seats because he was worried that if he got hit before the jump, he wouldn't be able to go out with the others. Cobb agreed to change places with him, and then Cobb ended up getting wounded instead. It's one of those small moments that reveals a different side to him than the reputation people often focus on, and then there's the incident during the last patrol. In reality, when the wounded German soldier was crying out from the riverbank, Webster suggested silencing him because they were afraid he'd expose their position. They threw grenades but missed, and Cobb eventually killed the soldier with a grenade of his own. Afterwards, he became heavily drunk, which the series did portray. But historically, the confrontation afterwards was apparently even more serious. Yeah, I knew all about that. Some of it was filmed too, although quite a bit never made the final cut. We definitely shot the grenade scenes. There was even another moment filmed where Cobb, completely drunk, was trying repeatedly to throw a grenade across the river and failing several times before finally managing it. There was also material involving him drunkenly threatening to shoot a horse. A lot more backstory existed in what we filmed. The assault on Jack Foley wasn't shot, but I was aware of the real story behind it. Apparently, Cobb became aggressive enough that he nearly got himself shot, and Colonel Sink supposedly remarked afterward that Foley could have spared everyone future trouble by simply killing him then and there. Those details were known during production. I think there was concern at the time that Cobb might come across too negatively if all those scenes stayed in, so some of the material that gave context to his behavior ended up being removed. That's the reality of television production though. You shoot an enormous amount of footage, and not everything survives the edit. My disappointment was that none of those deleted scenes were ever released later because they added layers to Cobb's story that viewers never really got to see. As it stands, his storyline in the finished series can feel slightly incomplete, almost as if pieces are missing, but ultimately those decisions are out of an actor's hands. Still, we did film quite a lot of it. The grenade incident absolutely happened in the filming. Cobb really was the one who silenced the wounded German soldier, and that darker side of his wartime experience was something we explored much more deeply than what audiences eventually saw on screen.